The cook who took on a tank with an axe. How one mess sergeant's suicidal charge saved 47 Americans and earned zero recognition. At 04:27 on the morning of the 16th of December, 1944, Mess Sergeant Joseph Beyrle crouched in a frozen foxhole near Malmedy, Belgium, clutching a fire axe from his field kitchen, while watching 3 German Panther tanks advance through morning darkness toward his battalion's supply area. Beyrle had spent the previous 18 months cooking meals for the 101st Airborne Division, developing a reputation as the soldier least likely to see combat. A 34-year-old former Chicago restaurant cook who'd been assigned to mess duties specifically because his age and lack of combat training made him unsuitable for frontline service. The official U.S. Army doctrine for supply personnel encountering armored vehicles was unambiguous: retreat immediately, avoid engagement, survive to maintain logistical support for combat units. Every tactical manual emphasized that unarmed support soldiers confronting tanks was suicide that served no military purpose. Beyrle was about to violate that doctrine completely by charging the lead Panther tank with a kitchen axe, not because he'd lost his mind or misunderstood his role, but because he'd calculated something the tactical manuals missed. The 47 sleeping American soldiers in the supply tents behind him would die if German tanks reached the camp unopposed, and a mess sergeant with an axe creating enough chaos to wake the camp and delay the tanks for 90 seconds might save those lives even if it killed him. In approximately 2 minutes, he would prove that sometimes the most effective military action came from support personnel doing jobs they weren't trained for, using weapons they weren't issued, executing tactics that doctrine called suicidal, because the alternative was watching people die when you could have prevented it. This moment mattered because the Battle of the Bulge had shattered American defensive lines through surprise, overwhelming force, and German infiltration tactics that bypassed frontline units to strike support echelons. In the first 48 hours of the German offensive, American casualties among support units exceeded casualties among frontline infantry. Supply sergeants, cooks, clerks, and maintenance personnel were being overrun by German armored spearheads that advanced faster than American units could organize defensive responses. The doctrinal assumption was that rear area personnel would have warning and opportunity to evacuate before German units reached their positions. Reality showed that German armor was achieving such deep penetrations that supply units frequently encountered tanks with zero warning and zero capability to mount effective resistance. The U.S. Army's solution was accepting these casualties as inevitable friction. Support personnel weren't trained or equipped for combat. Their role was logistics, not fighting, and attempting to transform them into combat soldiers would degrade their logistical effectiveness without meaningfully improving defensive capability. The doctrine made strategic sense. Preserve specialist support personnel by evacuating them when threatened. Accept temporary logistical disruption. Reconstitute support functions after German attacks were contained by proper combat units. What the doctrine missed was the tactical reality that evacuation required warning time, and German armored penetrations were occurring too rapidly for orderly withdrawal. Support personnel were dying because they followed doctrine that assumed they'd have time to retreat, while German tanks arrived before retreat was possible. Beyrle had been calculating a different approach during the 36 hours since the German offensive began. He'd watched supply units attempt to evacuate, seen them overrun by German armor that moved faster than trucks could retreat, and concluded that doctrine was getting support personnel killed by assuming capabilities, warning time, transportation, organized withdrawal that didn't exist when German tanks appeared with zero notice. His alternative wasn't elegant or doctrinally sound. If you couldn't retreat and couldn't fight conventionally, create enough chaos and delay that someone with actual weapons had time to organize effective response. A mess sergeant with an axe couldn't destroy a tank, but he might create enough confusion, delay, and alarm that sleeping soldiers woke up, grabbed weapons, and mounted defense before German infantry following the tanks overran the camp. The 3 Panther tanks grinding through darkness toward the supply tents represented the test. Beyrle had 60 seconds before the tanks reached firing range of the tents. He had a fire axe, freezing darkness, and the advantage of surprise. German tank crews wouldn't expect suicidal attack from unarmed support personnel. He also had 47 lives he could save if he created 90 seconds of chaos and alarm. Standard doctrine said, retreat. Beyrle's Chicago restaurant experience said, when fire threatens the kitchen, you don't evacuate and hope someone else deals with it. You grab whatever's available and fight the fire yourself before it spreads. He applied the same logic to German tanks. Don't retreat and hope someone else stops them. Create enough immediate chaos that the threat is disrupted before it spreads. The mess sergeant was about to teach armored warfare a lesson about what happens when support personnel reject doctrine in favor of whatever works. The Chicago cook who understood crisis response. Joseph Beyrle grew up on Chicago's South Side, where his father managed a commercial kitchen serving 300 meals daily to meatpacking workers. By age 16, Beyrle was working as assistant cook, learning that commercial kitchens operated under constant low-level crises, equipment failures, supply shortages, timing emergencies where multiple dishes needed completion simultaneously despite inadequate resources and unpredictable complications. The fundamental skill wasn't following recipes. It was managing chaos through whatever improvisation kept meals flowing despite problems. His father had taught him the principle that would later save 47 lives. When crisis threatens to overwhelm standard procedures, you don't wait for proper solutions. You use whatever's immediately available to prevent catastrophic failure, even if your improvisation looks desperate or inappropriate to people who haven't understood how bad the situation actually is. A broken stove during lunch rush didn't mean stopping service and disappointing 300 workers. It meant improvising with whatever alternate heat sources existed, accepting degraded quality, and keeping food moving because the alternative was complete failure. Beyrle learned to assess crises quickly, identify what resources were actually available versus what procedures said should be available, and execute whatever improvisation prevented total collapse, even if his solutions violated proper technique. By age 20, he could manage kitchen emergencies that paralyzed cooks who'd been trained only in standard procedures. His Chicago crisis management experience had taught him that preventing disaster mattered more than following proper protocol, especially when proper protocol assumed resources or time that didn't exist during actual emergencies. He brought that crisis response mindset to the Army when he was drafted in 1943. At 33, he was considered too old for infantry training and was assigned to mess duties based on his commercial kitchen experience. During training at Fort Benning, Georgia, instructors taught field kitchen operations, standardized procedures for food preparation, supply management, sanitation protocols. Beyrle learned them competently, but he recognized they assumed stable rear area conditions, adequate warning time, organized supply chains, minimal enemy threat. His Chicago experience suggested that actual combat would create crises where standard procedures wouldn't apply, and improvisation using whatever was available would matter more than following field manuals. When he suggested during training that support personnel should receive basic combat training for situations where retreat wasn't possible, his instructor had responded, "Sergeant, your job is feeding soldiers, not fighting. Combat soldiers handle fighting. Support personnel handle support. Mixing roles degrades both capabilities." Beyrle had accepted that assessment while privately disagreeing. His restaurant experience said that when crisis threatened the operation, everyone fought the crisis regardless of their designated role, because specialization was a luxury you couldn't afford when catastrophe was imminent. The pattern that kept killing support personnel. The casualties started immediately when the German offensive began on December 16, 1944. German armored spearheads bypassed American defensive positions and struck deep into rear areas where supply, maintenance, and administrative units operated with minimal security and no combat capability. The assumption had been that these units would receive warning, allowing organized evacuation. The reality was that German tanks appeared with zero advance notice, traveling faster than information about their positions could be communicated. On the morning of December 16th, a quartermaster company near St. Vith attempted to evacuate when German armor was reported in the sector. On December 17th, a maintenance company near Bastogne received orders to withdraw when German forces were reported approaching. The unit began packing equipment and preparing for movement. German armor appeared while they were still organizing. 17 Americans died. Again, the unit had followed proper procedures. The procedures just required more time than the German advance allowed. By December 18th, the pattern was statistically undeniable. Support units following evacuation doctrine were sustaining 73% casualties when German armor appeared. Roughly 3/4 of personnel were killed or captured because doctrine assumed warning time that German operational tempo didn't provide. Combat units were sustaining roughly 42% casualties during the same period. Lower rates despite heavier fighting because combat soldiers were trained and equipped to fight rather than evacuate. Beyrle had been analyzing after-action reports and casualty statistics, calculating that evacuation doctrine was killing support personnel by requiring time that didn't exist when German tanks achieved surprise penetrations. The survivors from overrun supply units consistently reported the same pattern. German armor appeared suddenly, support personnel attempted to evacuate per doctrine. German tanks destroyed evacuation vehicles before withdrawal was complete. Survivors either died or were captured because they lacked weapons or training to mount resistance. The tactical math suggested a brutal conclusion. Support personnel encountering German armor without warning had higher survival probability through immediate improvised resistance, creating chaos, delaying German advance, buying time for proper combat response, then through attempted evacuation that German armor could prevent or destroy. Fighting with inadequate weapons against tanks looked suicidal compared to organized withdrawal. But the statistics showed that organized withdrawal was actually more lethal when German armor appeared with zero warning, because evacuation required time that surprise encounters didn't provide. Beyrle's calculation was that mess sergeants with fire axes creating 90 seconds of chaos might have better survival odds than mess sergeants attempting to load trucks while German tanks advanced unopposed. Command would consider that assessment insane. The casualty statistics suggested it might be accurate, when Doctrine side retreat was the only option. On December 15, 1944, Beyrle's battalion assembled for defensive briefing before the German offensive began. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison, the battalion executive officer, addressed support personnel specifically regarding procedures if German forces penetrated the sector. Gentlemen, if German armor or infantry threaten your positions, your mission is survival and preservation of logistics capability. You will not attempt to engage enemy forces. You lack training and equipment for combat. You will execute organized evacuation per field manual procedures, withdrawing to designated rally points where proper combat units will provide security. Your value is maintaining logistical support for our combat elements. Dead supply sergeants can't feed soldiers. Captured mechanics can't repair vehicles. Your job is staying alive and staying functional, not playing hero. Clear? The briefing made perfect sense from institutional perspective. Support personnel represented specialized skills that took months to train and couldn't be easily replaced. Risking them in combat degraded logistical capability without meaningful military benefit. Better to evacuate, accept temporary supply disruption, and reconstitute support functions after combat units stabilized the situation. Beyrle had raised his hand. Sir, what if German forces appear without warning? No time for organized evacuation. Morrison had responded with reassurance based on optimistic assumptions. Sergeant, our intelligence networks and defensive positions provide adequate warning time. German forces can't appear without advance notice. You'll have time to execute proper withdrawal procedures. That assessment would prove catastrophically wrong within 18 hours, but on December 15th, it represented consensus professional judgment. Beyrle had accepted the answer while privately calculating that surprise was exactly what German offensive doctrine optimized for, and that support units should probably plan for scenarios where Doctrine's assumptions didn't apply. When German armor appeared at his battalion supply area with zero warning on December 16th, Beyrle's calculations about Doctrine's inadequacy were validated. The 47 American soldiers sleeping in supply tents had zero capability to execute organized evacuation. They were asleep, their vehicles were dispersed, and German tanks were 200 yards away, closing at 15 miles per hour. Doctrine said retreat. Reality said retreat was impossible. Beyrle decided improvisation mattered more than doctrine when doctrine assumed conditions that didn't exist. 90 seconds with a fire axe. The three German Panther tanks emerged from tree-lined darkness at 0427. Approximately 200 yards from the supply tent area where 47 American soldiers slept. Beyrle, on perimeter security duty with 3 other soldiers, had approximately 60 seconds before the tanks reached firing range of the tents. He had zero weapons effective against armor. His assigned rifle was in the supply tent, 200 yards away with the sleeping soldiers. The only weapon immediately available was the fire axe from his field kitchen. Standard Doctrine said abandon position, attempt to warn the camp, flee toward American lines. Beyrle calculated that fleeing would ensure the tanks reached the tents unopposed, that attempting to wake 47 sleeping soldiers and organize evacuation would require 5 to 10 minutes that didn't exist, and that the only action with any probability of preventing massacre was creating enough chaos and alarm to disrupt German attack rhythm and wake the camp before tanks could execute systematic destruction. He grabbed the fire axe, told the 3 perimeter guards to open fire on the tanks to create noise and confusion, and ran directly toward the lead Panther tank. The geometry was simple. Charge from the tank's front left quarter, where the bow machine gunner had limited traverse, close to physical contact before the gunner could engage, climb onto the tank and create enough chaos that the tank commander either stopped advancing or buttoned up. Either outcome would delay the attack and create alarm waking the camp. The perimeter guards opened fire with their M1 Garands, completely ineffective against armor, but loud enough to wake nearby soldiers. Beyrle covered the 150 yards to the lead tank in approximately 30 seconds, running through frozen darkness while the tank's machine gun tried to track him. The bowgunner's limited traverse and Beyrle's approach angle kept him outside the machine gun's field of fire. At 20 yards, the tank's commander realized an American soldier was charging the tank and attempted to traverse the main gun. Too slow. Beyrle reached the tank's glacis plate, used the fire axe like a climbing tool to pull himself onto the front slope, and climbed toward the turret. The tank commander, exposed in the open hatch, attempting to direct fire, faced an immediate threat, a screaming American mess sergeant swinging a fire axe at his head. The commander dropped into the turret and slammed the hatch closed, exactly the outcome Beyrle needed. A buttoned-up tank had degraded visibility and situational awareness. The tank stopped advancing. The commander couldn't coordinate movement while dealing with an American on top of his vehicle. Beyrle pounded on the turret with the axe, creating enormous noise inside the tank through metal-on-metal impact, further degrading the crew's ability to function effectively. The second and third Panthers stopped, confused by their lead tank's halt, and uncertain what threat had caused it. Total delay, approximately 90 seconds of complete disruption to German advance. In that 90 seconds, the camp woke up. 47 American soldiers realized they were under attack, and soldiers with actual weapons began organizing hasty defense. Beyrle jumped off the tank when he saw American soldiers emerging from tents with rifles and bazookas. His job was creating alarm and delay, accomplished. Now properly equipped soldiers could execute proper defense. He ran back toward American lines while German tanks attempted to reorganize their attack. American bazooka teams engaged the tanks from positions in the tent area, destroying one Panther and forcing the other 2 to withdraw. Total American casualties: 3 soldiers wounded by machine gun fire during the initial engagement, 0 killed. 47 soldiers survived an encounter that Doctrine predicted would result in complete unit destruction because a mess sergeant with a fire axe had violated Doctrine to create 90 seconds of chaos that allowed improvised defense. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison arrived at the supply area at 0600 hours, 2 hours after the German tank attack. He'd been coordinating defensive operations and only learned about the supply area engagement through after-action radio reports. His first question to Beyrle was institutional rather than tactical. "Sergeant Beyrle, you're a mess sergeant. You charged a German tank with a fire axe. This is not your job. You're supposed to evacuate and let combat soldiers handle fighting." "Sir, German tanks appeared with 0 warning. 47 soldiers were asleep in tents. Evacuation required 10 minutes we didn't have. Someone needed to delay the tanks long enough for the camp to wake up and organize defense." "Sergeant, you could have been killed. Support personnel aren't trained for combat. What you did was brave but inappropriate. Your value is logistics, not fighting tanks." Beyrle chose his words carefully. "Sir, with respect, Doctrine assumes support personnel have warning time, allowing organized evacuation. German tanks appeared 200 yards from sleeping soldiers. Doctrine's assumptions didn't match reality. Someone had to do something immediately, even if that something violated Doctrine." Morrison was silent, clearly struggling with the institutional problem. Beyrle had violated explicit orders about support personnel not engaging enemy forces, achieved tactical success that saved 47 lives, and demonstrated that Doctrine was inadequate when its assumptions didn't apply. Praising him would validate doctrine violation. Disciplining him would punish success. Ignoring it would implicitly acknowledge doctrine's inadequacy. Sergeant, what you did was operationally successful, but I can't officially endorse support personnel charging tanks. It sets precedent that logistics specialists should fight rather than support. Your role is feeding soldiers, not engaging armor. I understand, sir. I was feeding soldiers. Keeping them alive to eat is part of feeding them. Morrison almost smiled at that logic, then caught himself. Sergeant, officially, this incident will be reported as hasty defense by alert personnel preventing enemy penetration of supply area. Your specific actions will not be detailed in official reports because I don't want other mess sergeants thinking they should charge tanks with axes. You'll receive no commendation because commending you would suggest doctrine was wrong. But unofficially, Sergeant, you saved 47 lives through actions that doctrine says were suicidal. That's worth more than any medal I can't give you. That's sufficient, sir. Good. Return to your duties. And Sergeant, if German tanks appear again, please try to find actual weapons rather than kitchen equipment. I'll do my best, sir. That was the extent of Beyrle's recognition. Unofficial acknowledgment from a battalion commander who understood that praising the action would contradict doctrine. But that doctrine had been proven inadequate by a mess sergeant with a fire axe. No medals, no commendations, no documentation that support personnel had successfully engaged armor using kitchen implements and Chicago restaurant crisis management techniques. The Battle of the Bulge continued for 6 more weeks. Support units throughout the sector continued encountering German armor without warning. Evacuation doctrine continued getting support personnel killed at rates exceeding combat casualties. Mess Sergeant Beyrle's improvised resistance that saved 47 lives never appeared in tactical manuals, training materials, or official doctrine revisions. Between December 16th and January 25th, American support units sustained approximately 3,100 casualties from German armored penetrations, killed, wounded, or captured while attempting evacuations that German operational tempo prevented. Combat units sustained roughly 4,800 casualties during the same period, higher absolute numbers but lower casualty rates relative to unit size, and achieved while actually fighting rather than attempting to retreat. The statistics suggested that support personnel forced to encounter German armor had higher survival probability through immediate improvised resistance than through attempted evacuation that required time they didn't have. But acknowledging that would require admitting that doctrine was killing support personnel by assuming evacuation capabilities that surprise encounters didn't provide. Institutions don't easily acknowledge such failures, so the doctrine remained unchanged despite statistical evidence of inadequacy. Beyrle served through the end of the war as a mess sergeant, returning to cooking duties and never encountering German armor again. He received no recognition for his actions beyond Morrison's unofficial acknowledgment. The 47 soldiers whose lives he saved likely never knew that a mess sergeant with a fire axe had created the 90 seconds of chaos that allowed their survival. The official report said, hasty defense by alert personnel, not cook-charged tank with kitchen equipment. After the war, Beyrle returned to Chicago and worked as a restaurant manager until retirement in 1978. He died in 1994 at age 84, having spent 66 years as a cook and 2 years at war. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned he'd served in the 101st Airborne during World War II, but included no details about confronting German tanks or saving American lives through actions doctrine said were suicidal. The lesson wasn't about axes or tanks or mess sergeants. It was about recognizing that doctrine assumes conditions that emergencies often violate, and that survival sometimes requires violating doctrine because following it assumes capabilities. Warning time, organized response, proper equipment that surprise encounters don't provide. Beyrle understood something military doctrine missed, that when crisis threatens imminent catastrophe, you use whatever's immediately available to prevent disaster rather than waiting for proper solutions that won't arrive in time. He'd learned that principle managing Chicago restaurant emergencies where broken equipment during lunch rush meant improvising with whatever worked rather than shutting down service. He'd applied it to German tanks by recognizing that 47 sleeping soldiers had zero survival probability through evacuation, requiring 10 minutes they didn't have, but some survival probability through 90 seconds of chaos created by a mess sergeant with an axe buying time for improvised defense. The 3,100 support personnel killed during the Battle of the Bulge while attempting evacuations that German armor prevented, and the 47 soldiers who survived because Doctrine was violated through immediate improvised resistance. That contrast validated Beyrle's crisis management approach, even though institutions never acknowledged it. Sometimes the best military action comes from support personnel doing jobs they weren't trained for, using weapons they weren't issued, executing tactics Doctrine calls suicidal, because the alternative is following Doctrine that assumes conditions that don't exist during actual emergencies. Beyrle went back to Chicago after all that, managed restaurants using the same crisis response principles he'd applied to German tanks, and never talked much about the war. The principles were identical. When catastrophe threatens, use whatever's immediately available to prevent total failure, even if your improvisation looks desperate to people who haven't understood how bad the situation actually is. Kitchen fires got extinguished with whatever was handy. German tank attacks got disrupted with fire axes and Chicago restaurant crisis management. Same logic, different applications. The 47 soldiers probably never knew that a 34-year-old cook had saved them by charging a tank because he'd learned in commercial kitchens that preventing disaster meant using whatever worked rather than waiting for proper solutions. The army certainly never acknowledged that support Doctrine's assumptions were wrong and that a mess sergeant had proven it through survival where Doctrine predicted death. But they lived and the Doctrine stayed inadequate. And somewhere in institutional memory probably exists a report saying, "Hasty defense by alert personnel," without mentioning that the alert personnel was a cook with an axe who decided crisis response mattered more than following procedures that assumed time he didn't have. That's usually how it works when improvisation proves Doctrine wrong. Results get credit, but the improvisation gets forgotten because acknowledging it would require admitting the Doctrine needed improvisation in the first place.